For us, the biggest change, of course, is that Indigo has completely redefined the rules of the game. They established a business model, they stuck to their business model, and they did it in a very consistent way, and they relied entirely on leasing. And the sophistication and the professionalism that they brought to the table allowed that market to expand in a very significant way. And a lot of the players have benefited from that because leasing is a market where you need to have global standards, whether it's taxation, whether it's registration, formalities, a whole host of related things. And I think the discipline and the scale that we have seen from the largest airline here has helped us get comfortable with a lot of different exposures. And as we look ahead, I think we see the trajectory of that improvement even sharper and potentially room to do a lot more in a lot faster time. Before the pandemic, one of the assumptions we had going into our models was that if you were owned by a government, the government's going to step in, there's not going to be any issue, et cetera, et cetera. And if you were a low-cost carrier, you're likely to struggle. And as it turned out, the pandemic kind of completely upended that assumption in that the LCCs, Indigo in particular, maintained an exemplary payment record. So they were not $1 late, not 1 day late, entirely through the pandemic, which is an exceptional accomplishment. On the other hand, a lot of government airlines said, well, we're having difficulties. And so I think that credibility for us, not just for Indigo, but for all the other airlines who behaved in that way, has gone a very, very long way. So now when they come calling for capital, we will prioritize airlines based on some of the experiences that we've seen in their payment history throughout the pandemic. Now, the way we would think about that prioritization for the country is that when we look at India today, India is projected to be the third largest market by the end of this decade. And so as it relates to the capital that we'll have to allocate to keep our proportional presence here, capital for the country will naturally take a priority because it's one of the fastest growing markets here. And within that, I think now you have two super credible players and more than two players who believe in credibility as a mantra. So if you listen to Vinay, it's an enormously credible story, and we'd be perfectly comfortable giving them the benefit of doubt that they're going to become a large, credible organization. They're just starting at a different point in time. So for us, it's story by story, but in aggregate, the pool of capital that will come to this country is going to increase exponentially because the market is going to increase exponentially from our point of view. For us, it's not kind of sophisticated form of capital, but the peace of mind with which we get to deploy capital in this country. And as we know in aviation, there are multiple touch points that matter. So for example, India has ratified the Cape Town Treaty, but has not fully implemented the Cape Town Convention. And I think if we do that, that will be a next necessary step for us to feel a whole lot more comfortable. When we look at the ease or the lack thereof of doing business at the basic level, so registration, deregistration, when airlines get into trouble, how quickly can we move our asset, et cetera. I think facilitation of those things would be super important. Now recently, we can do electronic filing of IDERAs and stuff like that. And those are all, I would say, steps in the right direction, but consistency around which lessors can kind of repossess, lessors can do different things if contracts are broken, I think is very, very important because aviation is a mobile asset. The reason we can afford to lend it or lease it at incredibly low prices is that we know that when trouble hits, we could do other things with that asset. If our ability to do other things with that asset is impeded, then I think it causes concern. And India, for me, it's different. I grew up here, so I can think of the jurisdiction in a different way. But if you were thinking about the jurisdiction in a perfectly neutral, professional way, a lot of these things need to get to the next level. The last element I would say is a broader jurisdiction element which relates to taxation, right? So
I was coming to that.
yeah, so respecting double taxation treaties in the way they were intended, as opposed to trying to rewrite them or re-intend them or repurpose them, I think goes a long way in people's assumptions that what they are thinking in their economics are indeed what the economics are going to be, and there is no kind of unpleasant surprise down the road. So I think regulatory, infrastructure, taxation, these are all building blocks. So if you just look to economies who have done this right or economies who are at a different stage in their evolution, the end state is relatively clear. I mean, we can see certain jurisdictions who do it really well, and emulating that or getting as close to that as quickly as possible allows a lot more capital, incremental capital, to come into the country.
I think the operating lease companies do provide a very good solution to airlines, and I think they would be a dominant player. If you can look at overarching picture, you're just looking at cost of capital of airlines versus cost of capital of DAE, for instance. And there is obviously a arbitrage benefit to outsource that capital requirement to lessors who are very well equipped to manage aircraft risk as an asset class. Having said that, I completely agree with you that you need to see a multitude of other options. And things which you can potentially look to see over the next few years is clearly a lot more of insurance-backed financing, which, whether it's EXIM or, equivalent of EXIM like Balthazar and other insurance-backed financing. You potentially should be, I think IFSC and probably NIF could be a catalyst in terms of bringing Indian capital into play here. You could look at, I think at some point airlines would want to mitigate some of the risk in terms of US dollar risk. And so there could be some need for rupee financing and development of rupee structures. The disclaimer out here is aircraft is an US dollar asset, and currency risk is not an easy one to solve from a financier's perspective. Japanese market is very interesting. It is clearly very selective in terms of looking at specific names, and I think there are two names which potentially over a period of time develop their access in the Japanese market. The tax market provides a much more efficient form of capital, but it's got limited appetite, limited capital which it deploy. And access to international capital markets, I think it goes back to some of the points which Feroz talked about in terms of comfort level that ultimately the financing and the credit rating of the financing is subject to the assets, underlying assets, rather than and people getting comfortable that if things go wrong, they can get their hands on the assets. But one should be thinking about how that access could develop over a period of a number of years. And the last one, obviously, which is entirely new, and we saw one or two issuances of that, is sustainable linked financing, which is, given the whole bunch of new equipment coming in, it's clearly something which some of the airlines should look at over the years.
So we have been very, very actively looking at the Indian airports in the secondary acquisitions, as well as in the last round of 6 airports bid. We were very close, still we lost out. So finally we are going to get into a direct stake at the Goa airport. We have signed the document and it's in a very advanced stage of lender approval is pending. Hopefully it should happen within a few weeks. So our conviction in the Indian airports continue to be very strong, number one. Second, we as an organization, from what we started say 5 years before, we are moving slightly higher up the risk return chain. That means even on Goa airport, we commenced this discussion and like even when it was before operation. So we are slowly absorbing and digesting greenfield risk. Even in other sectors of the infrastructure, we have started doing greenfield. So we would be moving towards even the operational airports plus a brownfield expansion, everything. So from a NIF, the airport is still, we are convinced, and we would want to continue to play a significant role. Obviously, hopefully, we also move up in that. See, one trend, if you have looked at it very closely in the last 5 to 10 years, is some of these asset owners or the global pension funds, which have sticky capital, patient capital, they want to move up in the value chain. They do not want to be a passive financial investor role in most of the areas. For the first step towards it, most of them have set up their shops in India today, like say a CPP or a CDPQ or teachers or even British Columbia, they have hired on Indian. So when they are moving up the value chain, they want to have some kind of not I wouldn't say controlling stake, but at least a significant minority stake in any play that they are in. So that one challenge is about where they can invest, which is one question that is kind of we have to realign ourselves. Most of us, what we look at is, and it shouldn't color my view on aircraft leasing, is say because we borrow from the sovereign funds and the pension funds, right? They are looking for more yield play where the counterpart is more sovereign or a government or an infrastructure play. So they don't mind playing in the lower end of the risk return framework, but not higher up.